everyone. Good afternoon. So nice to see you all here. My name is Andenæs and I'm the director here, and it's a huge privilege to have the conversation that we're going to have today. It's a really fantastic thing for Kunstnernes Hus. We're very, very happy to have writer Siri Hustvedt with us here. Psychiatrist and writer, Professor Finn Skårderud, and of course Morten Andenæs, photographer, artist. Hopefully most of you have seen his show, which is upstairs to the right. We're going to keep it open a little bit extra today. Normally we close at 5, but we're going to have the exhibition open at least till 6 o'clock so that everybody will have a chance to see the show afterwards. This conversation is really about Morten's show, so it's kind of important that you see the show. And I also want to just say that it's for the first time this summer, since the 90s, that Kunstnernes Hus has a summer open program, so we're very happy and very proud of that. It is also thanks to Sparebankstiftelsen, so thank you very much. We have Jana Vinderen as well as Morten Andenæs, and the exhibitions are free the whole of the summer, so you can come in, plug out from daily life, and plug in here. We also have every weekend a film about fog. So if it gets too sunny out there, you can go into a black cinema and watch a film about fog for 15 minutes. And I reassure you, you will come out refreshed. And so, yes, thank you very much. These three people really don't need that much of an introduction, so I really want to just get straight onto it. So thank you very much, and welcome everybody.
Thank you, Anne-Hilde. I just want to have a quick word before we sort of start, just to say why these two. When Ida and Anne-Hilde, respectively chief curator and director of Kunstnernes Hus, approached me about who I would like to invite to a conversation, my first thought was Finn Skårderud and Siri Hustvedt. And luckily, we're here, and I thought about it this morning, that getting what you wish for is possibly a very scary thing. So bear with me. But for as long as I can remember, images and specifically photographs have literally touched me. My mother, who's present today, might be embarrassed now. Hi, Mommy. When I explain how, through a poster of Samantha Fox in a bikini on my wall at the tender age of 8, I could feel what it would be like to kiss her or have her arms wrapped around me just by sight. Now, part of why the work of Siri and Finn has left such an indelible mark on me for, come to think of it, more than actually half of my life, is because they too, in their work and through their public personas, acknowledge that whenever we engaged with the world, and art specifically, we do so with our entire body and our field of experience. Confronting a work of art or another human being is not simply about interpreting signs and symbols up here. It is to be present with all our senses and emotional luggage and potentially risk something. It's to risk being affected and in turn affect others, to risk being seen, even stripped naked, to risk having our deep-seated beliefs and narratives challenged, and it is to risk shedding parts of who we are today so we can be more developed versions of ourselves tomorrow. This might sound lofty, but it occurs to me that there are many who are wary of entering the space of contemporary art in fear that they just won't get it, and understandably so. But the way I see it, being human beings with everything that entails, we're all of us, practitioners, specialists, amateurs, and beginners, much more well-equipped to relate to art in all its myriad forms than we often give ourselves credit for. And if anything, that was perhaps my roundabout way of saying why I'm so thrilled to have the two of you here today. So, thank you.
Yeah. That was a beautiful introduction, I think, to what it means to look at a work of art, which is a big question. You know, what happens when you stand in front of something? That very simple question, which turns out to be fairly complicated, because as you said, you bring everything. You know, you look at a work of art one day and you have a stomachache. Might not go so well. And a certain kind of openness, I think, is required for all art. But I think about, let's take a picture. Finn, let's pick a picture in the show.
Actually, I was considering
taking
back because I'm owning the chimpanzee up here.
Yes.
Yeah.
You will take it back, but before
in
it's
August.
taken back.
No, because the first time I saw it, actually, I saw it in Gallery Ries when it was down there. I saw it from the outside. The gallery was closed. I was very frustrated about that. The next day I went back to the gallery and I said, I have to have it. Yeah. And because for me it's an immediate experience. Of course it's a sad monkey, but it's also a beautiful picture. And I think the transgression in documenting like grief, sadness, but it's done in a way that in itself is beautiful. So in a way we can move ahead. We are not frozen in the moment of sadness, but we can reflect on it. So I think I just had to have that picture.
But and I wonder, I mean, this is a question more than a comment, and you can maybe elaborate on this. The experience of looking at what feels immediately to me as if you're looking at grief. But it's grief that is somewhat alienated because it's a fellow mammal, a fellow primate, but still not a person. But it's almost as if it's stronger because it's not a person.
Yeah, I think that's a very, I don't think I've ever thought of it exactly that way. But I think when you say it, it makes a lot of sense, because I think that part of what we're so accustomed to images, and we're actually quite accustomed to also images of grief. Yeah. And we tend to look, it's very difficult to look beyond the kind of, I don't know, the specifics of the picture itself, and we end up instead just looking at, or in this case, we're able to simply recognize the form in some way. That there's something to a very resonant and very recognizable form in this monkey that perhaps is kind of like many have made the sort of comparison to Rodin's Thinker, that it has this kind of it's a form, also kind of like an urform, a form that we recognize immediately. But I do think that you're absolutely, it's very much stepping one step away enables us to actually see the sadness. But at the same time, I think this hangs well together with this kind of thought that we immediately sort of, when we see other people, we immediately project ourselves onto them in some way. Yeah. And that immediate recognition, you called it immediate, and I think that's a very important word, that it's something that seems not mediated, even though it is. That it is just there.
Yeah. Well, and it's, these postures that, recur in mammals of going in, the whole animal is tightened in on himself. There's a strange but great art historian, Abi Valborg. Do you know who he is? Anyway, he talked about recurring images of emotion in art, and one of the things he talked about, pathos formulas. And looking at that monkey for me is as if, I'm looking at some repetitive form in, human or mammalian life of of sadness and grief, and it's extremely moving.
I just want to finish. I just went to see Nick Cave. He has this new show he does where he kind of has, rather than just have a concert, he has a kind of a question and answer concert type thing where after having gone through the death of his son, he figured that, okay, he started receiving all these emails from fans, and he realized that where he made the gesture you just made, that this grief motion, that like hiding in one's own grief, you know, that having talked about it with strangers, he realized that it started opening him up, and it's just
you go and see, or you who have seen, you just want to put your arms around that monkey, you know, and rock him or her back and forth a little bit.
And I think it's interesting that it's an animal. I mean, you said something about it's easier to see the human through animals.
Yes.
Because there's kind of closeness in distance and distance in closeness.
Yeah.
And the iconic pictures by man has always very much been about animals, trying to demonstrate our world through those we are so close and distant from.
Well, you think all the children's books where you have anthropomorphic animals, this is an important strain in, fables and children's literature. It's the animals that you get to project into. There's a dog, too, in the show.
Well, I think that's this is a very important point. I think it just reminded me of, John Berger in his essay on why we look at animals. He says something like, man is a very solitary animal, and that he's kind of looking for, when he looks at animals, he's kind of looking for some kind of a connection. And I think in some way that when we look at animals, we have this need to identify with the world, but we find it very difficult because it seems so alien and strange. But through these children's books, and I think children's books are a very important way in for a lot of the things that I do, because if you go into the exhibition, there are all these kind of fragments we talked about a bit earlier, but if you even take the apple and the pear and the monkey and the Maria and the wall of the living room, and there's all these kind of basic coordinates that children learn oftentimes to actually deal with through pictures. That if you look at, and remember with my daughter, one of the most sort of interesting things and most moving things about how it made me see pictures anew was sitting with her at the table and looking through these picture books you have cutouts of, there's an apple, and there's an apple in the picture, and then there's the apple on the table.
Yeah.
And those are two similar things, but they belong to different kind of categories, and you learn about both pictures and your relation to the world, and you start, even talking about that with a child. You start talking about, okay, so there's an apple there, it might be my apple, or maybe it's your apple, or it's our apple, and there's our door, and then all of a sudden you start building a communal world through language.
Yeah.
So
it's a kind. Well, it's the reduction of apple to its appleness, if you will, and children are learning to read those, as you say, images or representations. One of the most moving experiences I've had in the last 5 years, I was giving a series of lectures in Tübingen, the University of Tübingen, and I was taken to an archaeological museum, and in the museum they have these little ivory sculptures of animals. You can identify them immediately: horses, bears, bison, and one little hedgehog that I instantly fell in love with, 40,000 years old. 40,000 years old, right? Think about this, that what we know anyway, written language, is only about 5,500 years old. People were making representations of their worlds tens of thousands of years ago. This is a deep human impulse. And no one, of course, knows exactly what the meanings of those animals were. You see them. I was in a cave in the south of France, too, in Nio, and you go deep into the mountain, and there you see these animals staring at you from the wall. It is the most startling and very, well, to use that word, maybe it's not a good word, realistic.
I think that could be a good step to really, as a therapist, we very often say, say more about that, Morten. Yes. Not about Samantha Fox, but I mean, you said already as a child you were very moved by pictures. Yeah. Say more about that, Morten.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I like that
Samantha
too.
Fox, Samantha
good,
Fox, Samantha
good,
Fox.
Good way. But even before Samantha Fox, I bet.
Well, I do think that I've always had a very, I've been very affected by pictures. I mean, I can remember, and I've written some of the things you've written about how, you know, touch in a picture. It's not necessarily about touch in a picture, but that you recognize something in your body recognizes something when it meets a picture, or it can be a tone from a piece of music. Or it can be, you know, just these really simple kind of gestures that, like, for example, sadness is also one such thing that you immediately tune in to another person in some way, or a picture, or... so I think from being... I think at some point that was probably what attracted me so heavily to pictures and to making pictures, because when I make pictures, one of the things I do is that I look for, not necessarily in the thing that I'm photographing, but in the picture itself, I look for that moment of kind of recognition, if you will, that you all of a sudden, you feel like, oh my God, there's this kind of magic feeling of there's something there that I respond to that's not up here, but that is kind of a very visceral and very sort of corporeal feeling, like a bodily feeling. But at some point, I think also having worked as an artist for, call it, 10 years or something, I noticed that I was distancing myself from it, that it seemed like that kind of immediate impulse wasn't kind of valuable enough in some way. And I think that this is, I've spoken to you about this, but this monkey picture is a really good example, because it seemed like it was too obvious, like it was too almost manipulative, that it was almost too easy to get a hold of. And that in that there was some kind of like, I can't do that, because if I allow people to just feel whatever they feel, then who the hell am I? But I feel like maybe I've come back to, and this exhibition has been a big part of that okay, we've spoken a bit about that, about what do I like, what do I immediately relate to.
Right.
And
Also, you could comfort yourself a little bit. Part of this is, art world, right? That the art world, for a very long time, since the 1980s, at least in New York, borrowed what was then called high theory or French theory to talk about art, and that theory was usually about language. So I always felt it was a big mistake, that images and textual symbols are not the same, and to use that theory was, barking up the wrong tree, so to speak. But the truth is, we only remember what has emotional value for us. Everything else is forgotten. So as an artist, it seems to me it's rather wise to pursue art that has some affect to it, because otherwise people are going to forget you really fast.
Yes, I've seen this exhibition sometimes now, and I know much of your work from before, and I think the whole point is it's affective pictures. I'm affected by them. So I'm really interested in your way of working. How many pictures do you throw away, and and how do you emotionally work with your camera and in your Mac?
Yeah, how do you pick what's here?
Well, we have this expression in Norwegian, å være I kjelleren, which is also a kind of an emotional state, but I work in the basement, so... no, how do I work? I mean, generally, the things that have ended up as pictures on the wall have been things that have... I'm constantly doing things, I'm constantly photographing, but there's never any clear-cut project. There's just a constant kind of cycle of, now I'm into this or now I'm into that, and animals recur, as do weapons, as do kind of the sky. All these kind of like basic coordinates are things that recur in my work, but I have to be, I never feel like, the pangs of inspiration. I never have these kind of like big, but I work pretty hard at what I do, so I think that I end up making a lot of things that never become anything, and all those, one of the things that I worked for a year for Tom Sandberg, who's an artist, Norwegian artist, fantastic photographer. Yeah. And if you look at the work upstairs, it's obvious that I've worked for him because there are, affinities there. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that he did, which I always found so amazing, was that he would just sit and look at his images. And I remember Anna, my stepdaughter, who's present here today, she asked me at some point, she came down into like our office studio and she said, "What do you actually do all day?" And I think it's a really good question because it's, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really look like I work that hard, but I spend a lot of time looking at what I do. Yeah. Like really, I make test prints and I sit there and I look at them and I look at them and I look at them. And when I do so, it's like I throw something out into the world in order to learn something new about the world. And the pictures that are on display are always the ones that, in some way or another, taught me something. Right. Where it's not just like I have this thing in my head that I need to get out. It's like putting the thing out there actually enables me to have a new experience about it. Yeah.
Which I think it might be time to ask about a more ambiguous picture, which you explained to me was about, it's a plastic wrapping with what you said was kind of detritus from your work. And it's a very haunting picture. I mean, I noticed it in reproduction too, right away. I thought, this is an image of something, unheimlich. And at the same time, it's not horrifying. I'm not afraid, but it gives me an uncanny feeling, and it's kind of ambiguous. I just wanted to know about your process of arriving there, at that thing. That thing.
I think, well, yeah, in order to arrive at that thing, I think when I started, because that's a new work, and when I started doing, how does one hold this so it doesn't become like that? Like that? Like that? Like that? Oh, it's very loud.
You have to eat it. To eat it.
Now, when I started working on this exhibition, I think the picture that's called Playing House, which is a large picture of some, like a blanket kind of draped down, was an early picture. And I had this idea that one of the things that amazes me is, again, this thing that just even a line drawing can make you feel an emotion. And I started thinking about these Pietà sculptures that we know in Western art history of Jesus kind of draped over his mother's lap. That they have, one of the things that they oftentimes do is that they give us a real sense of gravity. Like we really feel like it's just the weight of this Jesus character is so heavy. And even the Maria is huge, and the Jesus is oftentimes almost like small, but still there's this feeling of gravity, And I had this idea that I was going to make something like a Pietà thing, you know. And I don't do sculptures, and I don't know, I can't draw, I can't do anything like that. So it was a constant attempt at doing things that just did not work out. And the more I did that, the more I realized, like, oh my God, this is horrible. What the fuck am I doing? But I ended up instead, because that's often what happens, is that I end up then instead finding like, okay, well, I'm just going to put it away, but not out of sight. I'm just going to leave it there and see kind of what happens. And after a while, I wrapped it in this nasty kind of dirty. It had become dirty from doing like a cast, plaster cast. And it started being this kind of pulsating small animal in my studio that was just there. Every time I like looked at it, it was kind of like, psst, psst, look at me, you know? And when it does that, there's this feeling that, okay, well, I have to try to photograph it, and I did. And out of all the pictures that I did, this is the one that has this gesture. And the gesture is one of withdrawal, I feel. That it's like, it's kind of pulling away from you, but at the same time, it has nowhere to go. And it's completely out in the open. There's nothing, it can't hide from anything. And then taking that, as I told you, 10, 15 years ago, I came across the word umbrage in the American dictionary. Yeah, a word that I found so fascinating. Because, and it's a word that means to take offense. Exactly. So taking umbrage is å være krenkbar. And it's something that those who live with me and I myself am very aware that I'm very krenkbar and have been, you know. But there's also, the word and the phrase taking umbrage doesn't feel like what it means. It feels like taking shelter. And when I started looking at the root of umbrage and umbra and the umbel, I ended up in the umbilical cord. And so there's this whole kind of like, okay, well, maybe to be krenkbar or to take umbrage is also, it's a feeling you sit with in your stomach that is kind of detrimental or, could possibly like shatter your whole sense of self. And that's what being krenkbar or being krenket, to be offended kind of is. It's this feeling that someone is just impinging on my, ability to be myself. And probably because you're already kind of frail human being in some way. So it has all these,
it's overdetermined, as they say in psychoanalysis, about dreams, right? And this actually makes me think of a kind of dream image, where you're confronted with something that has no immediate identity. And it's really interesting to me that you brought up the umbilical cord, because that is, in a way, our kind of uncanny connectedness and something in Western culture that we've wanted to suppress. The fact that everyone begins inside the body of a woman, and then we're actually cut away from this other body. And looking at that image, I think it has all those strange meanings that can be generated just because you're not sure what you're looking at. I mean, I asked you right away, what's in there? What's in that weird like, plastic thing?
It has this kind of pulsating, breathing quality as well, as if there's something in there, like, almost like there's this one of the first works of art that really grabbed me, I think, was David Lynch's Eraserhead. I don't know if either of you...
Yes.
So in this movie, they end up, a man and a woman end up having a child together, but what this child actually is it a chicken, or is it it's this weird sort of, and they try to care for it, and it's just, it has kind of, that kind of difficult. Things that we don't know how to define are by definition very, very difficult to deal with, kind of. We just want to put them away.
Yeah, I think it's neither here nor there, neither this nor that. And, in Western culture especially, where we're very fixed on separations, on boundaries, on distinguishing one thing from another, that particular image is mining, if you will, our anxieties about definition.
Yes. So a way to speak about that picture is something like that. It says enough, but not too much, in a way, because it has a kind of openness for us interpreting as experiences, seeing it, but it says enough about something uncanny, and it's something about it's not differentiated. I mean, it's not set. So it has a scaring openness, but also a tempting openness, and I think. So I think that's interesting to see that sometimes some artworks that tell too much. So in a way they close the experience. This is in a way opening. This is absolutely a compliment, yes.
It is indeed.
But isn't that also you as a therapist then, that the ability to deal with all kinds of unexpected happenings and rather than try to close yourself down and say, okay, I am this and I make these kinds of pictures and I do this and I wear blue and I like apples and not that, constantly being aware of that there's a possibility to develop, that's it's a very stressful situation to be, to not be defined. It would be so much easier if we were just, this is me. It doesn't work, but...
No, sometimes, very often it don't work to be that definite. I'm thinking of, since you're mentioning being a therapist, it's a poem by Keats, an Ode to the Nightingale, I think it's called in English, where he has a phrase, negative capability. It's the capability to be together with negativity without collapsing. I mean, it's a kind of negative capability being around those kinds of images and, of course, around those kinds of people sometimes.
Yes, and I think, so what is, I love this phrase by a philosopher of biology, and he says, his name is John Dupre, he says, organisms are not things, but processes. We're dynamic human beings, but we also get fixed on static, on static categories and fixity. And I think art, you said it in your introduction, that in a way exploring unfamiliar narratives or moving into another place, and that requires tolerating both ambiguity and ambivalence. To speak of therapeutic situations, ambivalent feelings are the hardest things to tolerate. Love and hatred together, or aggression and tenderness that can be very closely allied in human beings.
Often been a starting point for me, actually, has been that kind of ambivalence, that precisely that it's not difficult to either hate or love. It's difficult when all those emotions exist side by side. That yes, I love you, but I also hate you. That's sort of, that it brings up in me so many difficult questions. And another, I don't know if he's present here today, but another very, I think Norway's wisest man said something like that: we choose our partner at the intersection between an ideal and an unsolved problem. And I think that
very smart.
It is, and I think that that is possible also to have as an experience when you confront artworks and when you confront an exhibition. I think we have this idea to think that when we enter an exhibition, there's this, again, like you said, a thing we have to get, that rather like we have to walk out of there with this certain, like there's two lines under the answer, and so we can also rid ourselves of it.
Yeah.
But instead,
Yeah.
looking at that, I mean, my point has always been, when I make exhibitions especially, is that there is no conclusion. There is just constant processes.
Yeah.
That there's always new ways of looking at it.
And talking about art in a non-art historian way, for me, and I think for Siri, not at least, is something about the meeting of art, or the art of meeting. I mean, it might be a successful meeting, or it might not. I mean, many pictures, many artworks are not interesting because there is no meeting. And a way for myself to describe it as the artist, like you, gives emotions, experiences a form.
Yes.
In Norwegian, that is quite funny because it says det gjelder å komme I form. It's in form, and then it's presented, and it might be that that form communicates with something not formed in me, but so it's a recognition.
Yeah.
But it might not be a recognition. So then I move to the next picture.
That's right. That's right. So it's, to use the language of philosophy and in psychology, to intersubjectivity, right? So the thing happens between the work of art and the spectator. It's in this encounter. And so some spectators will not respond, just as some readers, don't respond. But the good thing about all artistic experiences for me is they exist in what I call the aesthetic frame, right? So that uncanny picture that can be disturbing, it also is safe to ponder it. I know it's not going to jump out of the photograph and, strangle me or whatever, only in my fantasies. So the safety, or reading Crime and Punishment, I'm not worried that Raskolnikov is going to leave the book. But in my life, I might not want to have those encounters. I might need to protect myself. So art is a space where we can have experiences that we might not avoid in our everyday lives. And I think that's kind of a miracle.
It's a fascinating miracle, and Morten mentioned Eraserhead. I mean, actually it might be horrifying, but the film lasts 90 minutes. You can say it was only a film, and then you can leave the movie theater.
Yes.
So it's something about the aesthetic frame, as it's projections in the artwork, but it's also what you describe, a kind of protection, not only projection, but also protection, that you're protected because it's got an aesthetic frame, and you can leave it.
Yeah. So we have to get to some, so as I looked at your pear, I said that's a really erotic pear.
Say more about that, Morten.
Talk about your pear.
No, but I think that there's numerous things here that, because I think that the pear is yet another. The apple is an object that we associate so closely with desire, and it has these both denotations and connotations that are so, we know them, and it's difficult to kind of do them again. But it strikes me that the pear is this much more kind of aloof and difficult object to pin down. It doesn't have those, it's like there's this expression as well. It's like apples and pears, right? That they're these two completely different things. And pear, and the work is called The Shape of a Pear. And that is what it is a picture of. It's a picture of the shape of a pear. But numerous people have talked about how that picture has this very sexual, and I see it as well, but I see it perhaps more in, I have a difficult time looking at that image and desiring the image. I don't think I desire that pear very much.
But I think it reminds you of sensual experience, right? So it's an associative pleasure. It's not that you want to attack the pear.
Exactly. Some people do, though.
Some people do. Okay, I did not have that particular experience of it wanting to attack the pear, but it did make me think of erotic sensual experience. So it's as if it produces a kind of associative chain, at least in me, that was very, very nice.
But thinking about it, I wonder when I start thinking about, okay, what is kind of, if you start thinking about what is sensual, sexual pleasure, all these things, then there is no, how do you speak about it? How do you, I mean, it's a very sort of a shape-shifting kind of a thing that has, it can go all these different ways. It's difficult to sort of pin down what exactly that is, other than, like, one of the things that I've sort of talked about a lot is this idea of being enveloped by a picture and feeling like there's something about the pair that it's just there for, I don't know, I find it really difficult to talk about that image, actually. Yeah. Because it's so complete.
Yes,
like there's,
right.
It's just...
And it really is pair. It's not as if you've kind of, let's say disguised it so that we might mistake it for anything. It doesn't look like anything else. And I think, of course, this is what's interesting about looking at art. As you said, if it's a one-liner, and there are a lot of one-liners in the art world these days, if you know what the joke is or what the thing is about in a couple of seconds, it doesn't hold your attention. So this thing, it's not as if my mind was filled with, specific pornographic images. It wasn't that at all. It was just that it gave me a feeling of sensuality and human erotic feeling that was not highly specified, but that was what I felt after a little while of looking at it.
It's nice that it can go that way, that rather than, because there are famous pictures, of like women as pear-shaped in photography, obviously.
Yes, there are.
It's a very sort of a classical tome, but this thing that is just there on its own. There's also been this, for me, there's always one of the sort of pleasures about doing photography is that you're able to, kind of like how a child will represent again the world in play and do things that are completely normal. They will eat dinner or go to the bathroom or brush their teeth or, play with just being in the world, and it's a representation of the world. And it's to see what things look like, or to see kind of what it is to just be. And there's always been this idea in my head that if I can just make a picture that is just like the thing, there's something, because, and that's something that I'd like to get back to, because I have a really difficult time of being in the world and being here and now without having the little voice on my shoulder kind of commenting on everything that's going on. And when I make a picture, or when I go look at pictures, I often am able to simply be immersed in the picture. And I think that that's like having I call it like an immediate førstehåndserfaring is something that I feel more and more is this vital need in me to have, but I find it so difficult. Like I don't know if this is what I would go to be, go to like a course in mindfulness to learn or something. But I feel like it's a problem, but it's a problem that I kind of enjoy. That.
No,
I don't know if there's a question in there.
No, I think that's so that our perception. Right, the way we see. I mean, if you walk through the show, I think something that one feels is that you are looking at things, but most of the time we see what we expect to see. Right, this is how perception works. It works in patterns. They're determined by the past. Mostly, our full consciousness is saved for surprise. And I think one of the aspects of art, and certainly in images, is that you can look at an ordinary thing, and the longer you look at that ordinary thing, the more complex detailed, the more I did this with an experiment with a Perrier bottle on my desk. It was like, let's do a phenomenology thing. I looked at it for 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, that thing, I could see all the condensation. I saw the back of it. And your photographs give me that feeling of a thing seen, but not through the kind of banal expectations that we have when we walk through our everyday lives. The pairness emerges, and it's quite large, the pair. So you're confronted with the pairness and whatever associations you have in a way that you are not with the pair on the table.
Yes. Different ways to comment on it. Nietzsche said that looking takes a long time. We very often see through ögonblicket, and that means that we don't see so well. I mean, seeing well takes a really long time, so I think it's a good idea that you stare at your own work in the basement to see new things. But that's also the stilleben. I mean, these are stillebens that you take 1 second, you stop it, and then you can look and look and look, and then you can get the possibility to see through daily rituals, see through habits. So to stop and frame it, I mean, that might be a way to wash your eyes, actually.
Yeah, there's this wonderful quote that I keep coming back to by the French writer Alain Robbe-Grillet. And he says something to the effect of, the most remarkable thing about the world is that it exists. And I think that in that, there's this sort of wonderful acknowledgement about the fact that, I mean, I was having this conversation with a friend yesterday, and she called it ding dong, that it was just, it's insane that all of this is, and that we are, and that we're doing all this stuff, and we wear these clothes, and everyone's acting like, it's just all what we do. We come here and we talk about, these things, and but there's this fundamental feeling, and I think that goes along with the kind of unheimlich idea, that there are these moments in a day where you walk around and you notice, oh my God, this is, there's underneath us, there is just, this void and scary darkness, and we're here doing this, on this planet. There's how big is the universe? I mean, it's just, there's this, and I think that making these pictures is a way also to just, try to sort of partake of that experience of this is here.
But listening to you concerning your voice, your critical voice, I imagine, and sometimes that you don't have it while working with pictures or looking at pictures. I mean, French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he writes much about corporal experiences you refer to, and he speaks about our openness to the world. And very often we are in the world, but we are not open sensorically to the world. So we just pass it in a way. And in a way you're describing that you open yourself in a way, looking at pictures. And he wrote that there are two things that inhibit our openness. And one thing is strong rationality. Veldig mye fornuft. And the other thing is illness. If you are ill, you are not open. So, I mean, illness and rationality, well, many people experience both at the same time. So, being sensorically open, it's a challenge. And I think art can help us in that. Or walking in the nature.
Or one could say that hyper-rationality is an illness in the culture, right? So, Maurice Merleau-Ponty also said a beautiful thing, it's not I think, it's I can. So, that's the emphasis on a body moving in space, doing. And in images or in photographs, there's that, it's a stopped moment that we can examine over and over again. It's a kind of wonderful indulgence in a way.
There's again another writer, but there's this quote by, I think it's or it is Juna Barnes. I'm not sure exactly the wording, but she says something like, "An image is a space, or an image is a stop the mind makes between uncertainties." And in that there is this, I think, this wonderful thing that when you look at a picture, it's not like, and that maybe that comes back to the pair. It's not that the space of looking at the picture is a feeling of certainty, but it's not uncertainty. And that perhaps is that feeling of, I know this, I know what this is. But thinking of this, you know, that you, to be open is at times really challenging, because, you know, to be completely open, how can you walk through Slottsparken and get to the other side if you, you know, if you're completely open? It would just be, you know, we would never do anything.
No, and from a practical point of view, you know, we need social selves, we need amnesia, we need all kinds of ways to navigate the world. But we also, you know, you were talking about your friend, and you take one step back, just one, and you arrive at a place I think a lot of children go through. I certainly remember thinking, isn't it weird we have these holes, you know, in our face, and this thing that sticks out, and these kind of glassy, I remember thinking about human bodies and how weird it all was. And I think we need that alienation from the ordinary, and that artists maybe particularly explore that sense of awe. It's not even so much the uncanny, but the sense of awe at, you know, an American poet has a beautiful line, "Our lives are a strange experience." And they are.
But thinking of this exhibition and your artwork through years, Morten, it's more obvious to me now that you dare to go to some very basic forms, like the form of a pear, like the uncanny plastic things, like the depressed chimpanzee, like the Maria, which actually, her name is Maria, but this Maria Madonna character, I mean, very, very basic. I mean, is that correct to comment in that way?
I think so. I think that I mean, one of the things that I'm very interested in is how do we become who we become, right? And we become the people we become in very large part because of these basic things in our life, you know? Who was my mother? Who was my father? Where did I grow up? What was my home like, you know? But I'm also, I think that playing around with that, playing around with these completely basic sort of coordinates for what sort of constitutes our world is also a way of trying to make sense of, you know, one thing is trying to make sense of how does a life function, but what happens when a life doesn't function, or what happens when we become, for example, we're full of shame and guilt, and you know, these are things that are very present, at least in the way I think about my work. That, like, for example, I mean, I can sort of joke about the pear and the, you know, all these things, but I think that, at least for me, the whole idea of sexuality has taken me a whole lifetime to even come to terms with the fact that I'm you know, a sexual being. You know, why is that? I mean, thinking about, like, the fact that we're just here and it's strange, but why is it so difficult to talk about these things? And it still is. I know that the kids today have, it seems like they have a much more sort of an open language for what it means to have an inner self and be a sort of a subjective person in the world, and, you know, feelings and stuff. But at the same time, I still think there's lots of shame. And I mean, you know a bunch about this, but why? One of the basic coordinates of our life is also what we learn not to divulge, what we learn not to talk about, how we learn to sort of keep things on the inside. And what happens then when we do keep those things on the inside for, you know, 10, 15, 30, 50 years is, you know, there's all this, like, explosive sort of anger going. And I think that that's also something that's prevalent in my work, is that there is this tension there that is on, there's something that's about to fucking implode. Yeah.
So here's a question in relation to that is, walking through the show, I had that sense of, remember I said there's the missing infant. And there's also the skin, the tiger skin, that, you feel that the body of the animal, of course, is gone. But there's like the ghost shape of the animal. And then there is I think it's a sheet, or maybe it's the folds, the drapery image, where I think some of these tensions that you're talking about were felt by me. Would that
No,
feel
I think
right to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's this one picture, the large picture of the black and white picture of the blanket is titled "Playing House." So that's actually a picture of my daughter playing house under the blanket, and doing that whole representation thing. But in that, and that's why we made this sort of crude circle form, and we had architects that helped us do that, was to kind of talk about this space where you go, your own little space, where you can sort of, on the inside be who you kind of feel like you are, or you can kind of go in there and live with all of your anxieties and your rage and or it's just a place for saying, okay, I really like a picture of the moon. I'm just going to have that, in this safe little space. But absolutely, these are things that, like the tiger is one of those pictures that has this. I mean, it's obviously that something went really wrong. That's it's just
disturbing.
Yeah,
I find that image disturbing.
Yeah, and I think that this is it's important to acknowledge the fact that however sound a home you grow up in might be, there's all this lack, that defines a person, or that defines who you become. And if that stuff is not dealt with, that stuff is going to be very, very potent and very, very dangerous. And I think that that's one of the things that is. I mean, we've seen it in Norway with Utøya. It's we see it with your line of work. I mean, all these what are all these eating disorders? It's this self-destructiveness that's just eating away at and this self-destruction is a very sort of a strange. At least for me, it's something I know kind of intimately, but something that I still find sort of strange, that we do this, that we find a way to actually break ourselves down. And I think the two of you can probably talk more about that than I can.
But when you say something now, Morten, about tensions, anger, explosions, implosions, and you are in a kind of dialogue, not necessarily explicitly, but dialogue with your work. But to what extent do you reflect on us, those who will see these days? I mean, are we a part of this, or is this a kind of intimate dialogue with yourself and your work?
Well, as I said earlier, it took me 7 or 8 years to show the monkey, because I feel like, who would I be if I showed a picture like the monkey? That it's so having even come to a point where I'm okay with the fact that I'm going to show that monkey because it's something that I think people need to see. I think it's something that would allow a viewer an experience. I think that I think that 5 years ago I was probably more concerned with who I would become when I let the work out to my studio than with what people would kind of in the end see or experience. And I think that that has probably been one of the biggest changes of the last 5 years for me, has been that I'm more sort of interested in what kind of a community do we create when we talk about pictures. Because I think, as I said earlier, that we start out at a very young age talking about pictures, relating to them, and they have this power to create community, basically. This is why we're sitting here today. I feel like it's it's a part of that. So I think that someone who's present here today, she said that I had given you a complete kind of like a mind fuck. I think that was like her precise word, and I thought it was really great, because it is, when I make what I make, I sit at home and I try to make something that's open enough that it's not like it's just open to be open. It's full of references and cross kind of references, and these pictures talk to those pictures, and there's a system in it, but it's a system that allows for allows a viewer to navigate in very different ways.
Does that mean that you, to some extent, make different pictures now than for 8 years ago, for example?
I think both yes and no. I think I show different pictures now than I made, because I think that that's the distinction, is that I used to, or not, I mean, it's not like I've always been that way or always been this way, but there was at least a while where I was very sort of frightened, basically, about what it would mean if I showed, for example, the picture of the monkey, So I think that, and I think that what's happened is that I have more of a sort of a faith in the fact that, okay, I'm a person of this world. I like this picture. I'm going to show that picture because maybe that once in a while it's enough. I like it.
No, and I think, growing as an artist is also realizing that if you're anticipating responses from others while you're at work, you're screwed.
Yeah.
I mean, you really, I think, are screwed. At the same time, I remember when I was writing poetry as a young woman, I used to have these books of famous poets open on my desk, as if I could just inhale their greatness, and I was much more conscious of influence, what was good, what was serious, and that was broken for me when I was still in my 20s and I was stuck. I couldn't write anything, and a poet and professor friend said, "Oh, Siri, when I get really stuck, I just do automatic writing." And I sat down and it just 30 pages poured out of me. I spent the next 3 months editing those 30 pages, and I thought, oh, I'm free. And, I really never turned back after that. But I think it was suddenly, it didn't matter about, this kind of self-consciousness about being a poet or being a photographer or, meeting the expectations of some outer reality, which I think is very usual for young people. And I think a degree of, that self-consciousness, who was it? Churchill, if you can't be pretentious as a young person, I mean, when can you be? Right? So might as well get it out of your system then.
But those expectations are also something that I think, at least for my sake, is very something that I also grew up with. That it's that you kind of think, well, if only I do this, then they're gonna like me or they're gonna love me, or if I'm good at sports or I'm good at whatever. And it's like a deep-seated thing that for some perhaps never actually disappears. That you have to kind of go through some process where you actually somehow lose that and see that, whoa, the world actually doesn't really care that much. I mean, this is,
I
think that's what my samboer, what she would say that, but no one's actually looking, it doesn't really matter. I think that's a really astute observation.
Well, yeah, I mean, and also there's the very funny thing that I borrowed this from a psychoanalyst who was writing about artists, and he used the phrase adaptive grandiosity, which is one that I've borrowed because every artist has to have the gumption to think that whatever you're doing, somebody might want, or that whatever is in there somehow has value. I mean, that's already incredibly arrogant, right? I mean, it's already so thinking so much of your own inner life, if you will. But in order to survive, the other side of that is a lot of rejection, a lot of people, hating you when you get what you want, which is, say, to be published or to be shown, and then, people dump on you, and you have to be able to just put that aside. And you can only do it if you have some adaptive grandiosity.
I think it's a beautiful concept because it also stresses adapted. I mean,
That's
the
it.
kind of grandiosity.
In the old sense of the,
why
in the
should Siri
Darwinian,
Hustvedt sit alone in 3 years in a room and typing
Right.
if you didn't believe in this?
Yeah.
And why should Morten stay in the basement staring and staring and staring?
Exactly.
If it was not an experience of that has
Yeah.
meaning.
That's right.
It's production of meaning, and you have to believe in meaning.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a funny thing. I mean, being an artist is a weird thing. But, I always feel more alive when I'm doing it.
I also think that, and that's been kind of a realization the last couple of years, is that, like you said, the production of meaning, you have to have this kind of strange belief that there is, in fact, even though we know there's, we have to have this belief that there is a purpose to it, that it makes some kind of difference, that it has some sense. I can't remember where I read it recently, but someone made the distinction about, made a comment about how we talk about it as sunrise and sunset still, even though we know that that's not what actually happens. It's not like the sun, goes down and comes up. But that we treat it like that's
we're not the center of the universe.
Apparently not, But that kind of like that also that kind of that willingness or ability to be also naive is kind of and I think in that sense there is, however serious I am as an artist and however serious any artist is, there is also the sense that there's a kind of childlike play at work that you're doing, you're playing, and that in that and taking that playing as seriously as a child of 5 might when they're underneath a blanket, doing their
Yes, playing is extremely important, and you should take it really serious. In the sense of in school system, etc., we should not go into that, but they are not necessarily playing. And I think there are, referring to us three, I mean, there are very close relationships between art, producing art, looking at art, and writing and being a therapist in a way, because all these are playful activities. Siri told me some years ago about when Freud wrote about psychotherapy. He called it in English en tumleplats. En tumleplass. It was translated to playing ground. I mean, we are playing with realities and we throw it to and fro. It might be okay, it might be not okay. It's not the correct or wrong. It's the playfulness in itself that's important. Yeah.
And that translation, D.W. Winnicott, the wonderful English pediatrician and psychoanalyst who wrote a lot about playing in reality, he says, some people have to learn how to play. And he takes the Freudian idea of transference, the space, if you will, between the patient and the analyst, and says that this is the playground, and he talks about it between infant and mother, and that this transitional space, if you will, is also the place of culture and art. And when he talks about culture, he also means creativity of all kinds. Baking a pie, you know, children playing, and artists making art. And I think that's very important, that we start to think about artistic creation as a human activity, not something that's done by like weird people on the side, right? But this is part of human development. It's creativity that all people engage in, and if they can't do it, there's something paralyzed that needs to be addressed and fixed.
Donald Winnicott, as a pediatrician and psychoanalyst in London, he was bicycling to his office, and he had his foot on the stair. So he was sitting and with the foot on the stair, and he was stopped by a policeman, and the policeman said, "You are behaving like a child," the policeman said. And Winnicott said, "I take that as a compliment," he said. Yeah.
Yeah, he really looked at children. Speaking of looking, he looked very, very hard and carefully at children.
I think it looks like
It's
we're
done.
being prompted to
Wrap
be
it
done
up,
with
kids.
it. Yes.
Wrap it up.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and it just keeps getting better and better. I don't feel like I can keep people here all day, but it's been such a privilege to hear you speak. And you made an expression earlier on saying to wash your eyes and to see reality. So hopefully now you will have time to see the pear and the monkey and the apple, because they're all hanging up there. And thank you so very much for coming and talking to us about it.